Greetings duelists and welcome to another video. So today I'm going to do something a little bit unique to this channel. I might make it become a segment depending if the viewers like it and if the stars align during each format. And this is what I'm going to call a format epilogue. What do I mean by that? It's basically when you have a format about to end and you see what is a good transition from one format right into another format. Obviously, these are very, very varied. Sometimes we get forbidden limited lists that might just end the format or just end the era right on the spot, and they're not as predictable. However, this event, being YCS Bologna, was the perfect example of a segue from one format changing into another one. And what do I mean by that? So, if you guys already know, by the time of this recording, it is November 29th, meaning that Crossover Breakers is going to be debuted next week on December 5th, and that set is going to change the meta most likely more than not, regardless of Forbidden Limited List. I'll go more into context of why that is the case. But before that, I want to talk about YCS Bologna because throughout the entirety of the Rage of the Abyss format, I think this event is the perfect way to end this current format. So, as you guys probably already know, YCS Bologna was streamed last week, and the event itself as a whole was very impactful. It was actually very great. It had a total of 2,500 players, which is a very large sample, very large player size. I think this is the biggest YCS of the entirety of Rage of the Abyss format. Not even Niagara, not even the South American YCS did as well as this. So, and you could argue that this probably was one of the higher tier events in the entire year as well, which is very, very surprising considering this is a format that is not favorable for many players. And here you see the results of the top 64, and these results are beyond impressive. Like, Snake Eye is at the top with the most entries, then followed by Fiendsmith variants, which we'll talk about. Then you have Yubel and Tempai, which was the two other aforementioned or expected decks to do super well. And then you have Ritual Beast, Fire King. You have Pure Kashtira, which we'll talk about that also as well. Centurion, Memento, Mermail, Chimera, Orchist, Labyrinth, Voiceless Voice, Salamangreat. I think it's 17 different decks that made top cut, which is very, very impressive. That is super good to see in a tournament. You usually don't see tournament with that many decks in top cut. I know the top 64 is a little bit different from top 32 and top 16 at other YCS events, but again, with the large player size that we had for this event, it was warranted to have that topping record, that topping transition. Now that we talked about the top decks that made it, let's talk about the conversion rates because that is super, super important. Despite Snake Eyes being the most represented deck in Top Cut, it was the deck that did almost as poor as most decks with conversion rate. Going from 12 to 4 and then to 3, that's not impressive for the deck with a deck with this caliber. And there's a reason for that. The second highest conversion rate would be Fiendsmith, and this does include other Fiendsmith variants, which we will talk about. I think this deck was like the star of the show. Like, I think if YCS Bologna needed to be defined by one name or like with one word, that word would be Fiendsmith. Or the return of Fiendsmith, like as we would say. Now let's talk about the third best deck with the conversion rate. I'm talking conversion wise, not best represented deck or best deck that did in Top Cut. Conversion wise, the third best deck was Ritual Beast. Like going from 6 to 4 to 2 in top 16, and then even one of them making top 8 is actually really impressive. Like compared to the other decks. Like Snake Eyes did have more tops in top 16 than Ritual Beast, but no Snake Eyes made it to top 8. And Ritual Beast is tied alongside Fiendsmith. Now let's talk about... I'm going to move out of conversion rate for a moment and talk about the decks in Top Cut, in top 8. In top 8, you have 2 Fiendsmith variants, 1 Yubel, 1 Tempai Dragon, 1 Memento, 1 Ritual Beast, 1 Mermail, 1 Orcust. 7 decks in top 8. And you can make the argument that it's actually 8 different decks because the 2 Fiendsmith decks were 2 different variants. So, yeah, we don't get to see this every day. This is, for me, absolutely beautiful to see. Like, whenever you see 8 different decks and like you just make it to the entirety of the top 8, and all decks are different. Like they're like you can make the argument that Memento, Yubel, and Fiendsmith pretty much makes 4 out of the 8 decks Fiendsmith decks, but Yubel and Memento have a very different playstyle than the Fiendsmith deck that we're talking about. At least the Fiendsmith deck that is here that even won the event. And then you have Tempai Dragons, Ritual Beast, Mermail, and Orcust. I don't think I need to explain how different all these decks perform. What I'm going to do is I'm going to show a few of the lists and talk about maybe something that they did that just makes it very like enticing to understand why they made Top Cut. So here's the Orcust list. You see 5 Horus main deck monsters in the main deck, and you see the 3 copies of King Sarcophagus and the 3 copies of the Field Spell. I think the Horus engine is completely underestimated. I think in a very mid-rangey format that we are right now, Horus actually does well in under a simplified game state. This is an engine that does not fall to most armies. So that is one huge advantage that it has. And the other thing about Horus is these cards thrive very, very well like under simplified game states, like I mentioned beforehand. Like if you are in a hand trap war with your opponent and you end up with Horus monsters on board, your opponent has a lot to deal with because not many people are playing spot removal in the main deck. Like if you been here on this channel and you saw like my regional top Ritual Beast list, you saw that I played back row removal in my main deck, and that is because that is something that needs to be respected. Like cards like King Sarcophagus, the Vault of the Imperial Tomb, Orchestrated Babel. Just to give you some examples, like obviously you have like Sinful Spell Deception as another example. Like all these powerful cards that just stay on board. Not many people have tools to get rid of those cards, and that is something that gives Orcust an advantage. Another thing that makes Orcust be at a very strong advantage, and the same thing goes for all the Fiendsmith decks, that made top cut is there were no bestials running around for them to be worried about. I think in a format where bestials are popular, decks like Orcust are not going to do well. But in a format where bestials are not around, there's only so much you can do against Orcust. And the most impressive part about all of this is that this is prior to the new support that got revealed in the OCG. So, like, in the future, we might see Orcust actually do very well, like, at more future events. Another thing to talk about when it comes to Orcust is it's a deck that can play Dominus Impulse. Like, every deck that can play Dominus Impulse should be playing Dominus Impulse, and this is one of them. Like, it does conflict with the Guidance of Horus, but that's pretty much it. Like, it really doesn't conflict with anything else. And the trading, like, the floating effect of the Guidance for, like, Impulse Resolving is more than justified. Another card that we can talk about that they are playing is Super Polymerization. Outside of Tempai Dragons, not many people were playing this card. This card probably caught a lot of duelists off guard. And as we can see from the extra deck, this extra deck, like with these three cards, cover a lot of matchups. Centurion and Tempai Dragons get covered with this card. Mud Dragon gets covered by the mono type decks that does not like use the same typing, and Garura is very useful against a lot of other like decks. A good example is all the Fiendsmith decks that topped, they get like stopped by Super Polymerization because of Garura. So I think this is a healthy ratio of cards you should be playing for Super Polymerization. One of their win conditions is Topologic Bomber Dragon. They did not play Access Code. They did not play like other stuff like that. And the Topologic M-board is not a bad M-board to end on. This deck benefits very highly from SP Little Knight. I mean, just SP Little Knight just being a dark monster does not conflict with your Horus effects, which means IP just turns into like another layer of interruptions against your opponent that could tackle a lot of avenues. This deck can play Typhon really greatly. I think Typhon is going to come back into the meta game very soon. This card is actually really strong against what is going to happen next format. But yeah, not much to say about Orcust. I think after we get the new support, we might see this deck like do very well once more. If people don't play Bestials and people don't play cards that can check this deck might sneak in more tops in the future. The extra deck was very well equipped for the current format as well. Like Yubel and Tempai cannot do well against this card. Tempai cannot do well against this card either. Yubel also is a deck that can struggle against this card. So yeah, this card pretty much just shaves the Snake Eyes. Let's talk about Memento. So this deck made top 4. So if Tempai and Jubel are not in the picture, this might become the scariest deck in the format. Like, the endboards Memento can make are very disgusting. And another really impressive thing about this list, if you're looking at it, this list made top 4, and it plays 0 Fiendsmith cards. So for those thinking that Fiendsmith is something that carries Memento, this is a pure Memento list that made top 4. And it faced a lot of other decks. It faced against Fiendsmith decks, it faced against Snake Eye, it faced against like Tempai Dragons. And this deck did very well against all of them. Yeah, the boards you can make with this deck are very, very scary. Like, this deck, if they open correctly, can play around multiple hand traps, which is something that is also very disgusting. it's not a safety net against a lot of decks, but another card that also really helps them is the Goblin Breakout. This card came out in Rage of the Abyss, and this is essentially is an emergency teleport for Goblin monsters. Memento Goblin is a Goblin monster, so it fits that criteria well. And this card is another play starter, is another card, is another starter. So yeah, consistency and build wise, I think Memento is very up there. I think the next format, Memento is still going to be good. So if you're looking for a, like, well, I'm not gonna say necessarily budget, but like if you're looking for another really cool deck that is not a Fiendsmith variant, yeah, I'd say keep an eye out for Memento. Fiendsmith Chimera. So if you've been into this channel for a couple months, you already know this is my favorite Fiendsmith variant deck. This is pretty much my. I won't say it's my favorite fusion deck. I think my favorite fusion deck is right here. But probably my second most favorite fusion deck that is actually relevant this format. If you have not seen the top 32 feature match of this deck, I do encourage you to watch it. It's very, very entertaining. It was this deck facing against Tempai Dragon, and this deck played circles around the Tempai player. The Tempai player summoned Quackimero Drago, they activated Rivalry of the Warlords, they did Impermanence on the King Chimera, on the Chimera King, and even with all of that, this deck managed to play through all those cards and still beat them. That was a very impressive duel to watch, and I do highly encourage you to watch it. Right now, there are only two real ways of building this deck. It's with the engine package or with the Azamina engine, with Witch and Wanted. I think post Supreme Darkness, we might see the Azamina version more, but for now, I think the engine version is one of the better ways to go at it. I really like Dark Fusion. That is like not the most popular take when it comes to this deck, but it is a card to think about. I really like the board breakers in this deck as well. I'm not a huge fan of Super Polymerization in general, but I have to respect this card. This card is very, very good this format. And yeah. So that's it for Chimera. Now let's talk about Ritual Beast. As I mentioned beforehand, this deck was the best deck that made, like, conversion rate wise, this was the second best deck. And obviously, the elephant in the elephant in the room is Dimension Shifter. This card is really, really strong against the other deck that topped. The Nemesis cards are very, very strong as well. Protoss, like, if that Ritual Beast player faced against Orcust, like, the Orcust player probably would have lost. Just with Shifter and Protoss alone, the matchup is incredibly on Ritual Beast's favor. Book of Eclipse is very strong as well. Even if you go second, like, they can't IP Masquerena you, for example, unless they have Galatea. This deck just strives with banishment, so like the resource game on Ritual Beast is very strong. And the one thing I have to keep mentioning with Ritual Beast, and if you've seen enough of my deck reports, you probably already know this by now. Ritual Beast is very, very good against multiple hand traps. Like, the only hand traps that really hurt you are high impact hand traps. One of them being Nibiru, and that card was not popular at this event. It was popular in the fact that the winning deck list did play it, but like in general, not many people played Nibiru, which is something that also favored Ritual Beast. My build is a little bit different. I don't play Dark Ruler. I don't play Fualos in the main deck. these are things I would experiment in the future. But yeah, like when it comes to Ritual Beast, 90% of the deck is pretty much the same, which is another thing that makes this deck like very impressive when it comes to their conversion rate. Like, if you face a Ritual Beast player, you probably know what the deck list is if you've seen the deck list more than once. Like, every card in the main deck is pretty much the same. The only main difference is probably Ash Blossom and Fualas. And like, Book of Eclipse is a staple, Inheritance of 3 is a staple, Teleport of 3 is a staple. You usually play like 4 to 6 board breakers, and you always will see the Prosperity, except if you're facing me. But yeah, there's not much to say about Ritual Beast. The very bad news is Ritual Beast will have a huge issue next format. Like, the big issue that Ritual Beast is going to face is people will play stronger non-engine cards that pretty much will cripple this deck. And it's not even because of Ritual Beast. So, for the current format right now, I say Ritual Beast is perfectly fine. I think it's easily one of the top 5 best picks, or top 10. But next format, that is to be debated. And okay, so the elephant in the room. Let's talk about Fiendsmith, or we can call this Fiendsmith Kashtira. So this was the most popular deck in the event. Almost all the really strong pro players played this deck. Joshua Smith, Nikke, Jack Verma, Pat, Nikke, just to mention just a few names. Like, there were a lot of really good players playing this deck. And in terms of its performance, this deck overperformed. So what made this deck play very well at the event? The reason this deck did so well is because of all the hand traps. If you look at this list right now, this is Pakawat's list, you will see over 20 hand traps. And basically the goal of this deck was to be as diverse as possible with your hand traps and stop as many oppositions as possible outside of back row decks. It would basically, this deck was an equalizer to all the combo decks out there, including Tenpai Dragons. And if you draw the right combination of hand traps alongside this engine, because Kashtira are very good as a standalone engine, as well as Fiendsmith, then you should be winning the game, because these engines are very recursive, and they have very strong sustainability against other oppressive cards your opponent plays. Like, this deck does not do very well against like heavy trap decks, but heavy trap decks were not popular at this event. Like, there was only one Labyrinth in top cut. So that pretty much just tells you that not many back row decks were popular at this event, which gave this deck a very strong edge. So the other thing that I have to mention is this deck is a perfect prelude of what's going to happen next format. Next format, Ryzeal and Maliss are going to debut, and this is the closest you'll see to what Ryzeal looks like. Ryzeal is a deck that has like a 10 card monster engine and can play a plethora of other different cards. And its playstyle is very similar to this one. And you could even make the argument that Ryzeal is even stronger, because Ryzeal's engine plays way better into hand traps than this engine. The restriction on that deck is a little bit heavier. Like, they cannot make link monsters, they can make only rank 4s. But their boss monster is so oppressive that it pretty much just wins against like a lot of like boards in general. So that's one big advantage that this deck has. The other cool thing about this deck is that, like, if you actually get stopped or you actually get hand trapped, like, you still have ways to build interruptions, which is another really cool thing about this deck. This deck can play Dominus Purge, which is another really cool tool that the deck has. Like, the fact that like this does not conflict with the Kashtira engine or the Fiendsmith engine makes it very incredibly like it makes it very incredibly convenient. The only card in the main deck that this conflicts with is Ash Blossom and Joy Spring, and you'll usually Ash Blossom before using Dominus Purge on most scenarios. So yeah, like performance wise, this deck was really, really cool. Now that we're talking about this deck, we can talk about the winning deck list. So this is the deck that won the event. And if you look at this deck and you look at this one, you'll probably see a few similarities. This did not play Dominus Purge, mainly because they played Charvara. But if you take this Charvara out of here, this deck would also play Dominus Purge because the only conflict it would have been Ash Blossom. The Magical Musketeer cards is funny because if you think about Magical Musketeers, you do not think about a small engine like this one. You think about like other cards. The only purpose behind these cards is they are more bodies that can make Fiendsmith names. That's pretty much it. Consistency wise, this deck is more consistent than the Fiendsmith variant because it does play more copies of Tract. It plays more copies of monsters that can become Fiendsmith. You can make the argument that the Kashtira cards kind of make up for it, but they did side in the Kashtira engine, which is a very heads up on their part. Basically, the other thing I have to mention is shout out to Matthew Burkhardt. Like this guy was a genius, and the reason I call him a genius is because this deck that he built it on his own. He did not have a player circle with other pro players making this deck. He did not have a discussion with many other people. No other person built this deck the way he built it, and he still arrived at the same conclusion that most of the pro players did when they built the Kashtira variant. So that is like another really impressive thing, like on their end. Okay, so now that we covered that, this is going to be the epilogue of this format. Ryzeal and Maliss are going to be very, very good decks. I think those decks will change how people play for the next format. Right now, if there is one deck in this current format that I say has a very strong chance against those two decks, like engine-wise, it would be Tenpai Dragon. And that could all change, like, on the next day if Konami actually makes a really strong Forbidden Limited list that actually addresses Tenpai, Snake Eye, and Jubel. And I don't think that's far-fetched. I think that is very, very possible. It's already been close to 3 months since the last list. So yeah, I think it's only a matter of time. But yeah, in conclusion, I think Rage of the Abyss was a very, very welcomed format. Well, it was an unwelcome format, but the way we see these results and we see how it ended, it kind of made it very, very favorable to see. This by far was my favorite YCS, I think, of the entire year to watch. Like, it was so incredible seeing like 8 different decks, well, 7.5 different decks in top 8. It was so refreshing seeing so many different strategies do so well. And depending on what happens with Ryzeal and Maliss, we might see like more events where more different diverse decks are just doing very well, very well. And slowly we're heading into the right direction in this game. I think we're slowly entering like into a division where mid-range decks or fair decks or like fair not once one turn like super combo heavy like gatekeeping will be happening in the format. There is the caveat of dealing with so many hand traps, but this is not the first heavy hand trap format that we've had in the game. Like we can look back at Drytron and Tri Brigade format. We can look back at the based deck, if you remember that. We can look back like when Tier Elements and Sprite like first debuted. Yeah, I think the format will adjust itself over time. But for the current moment, I think this is looking very good for the game. If we keep getting YCSs with results like these, I think more players will be incentivized to actually keep playing on future formats. But yeah, that's it from me. I hope you found this video informative to your liking and understanding. More videos coming soon. Keep practicing and keep dueling.